Welcome to session 5 in the series, Resident but Alien, How the Early Church Grew. I'm Alan Kreider, a historian of early Christianity, and in these final 2 sessions, I'm going to be joined by Hanna from Iceland and Liam from the United States. And in this session, we're going to be looking at the relationship between worship and witness. We've seen already that the early Christians grew because they were odd but intriguing, because they were in connection with spiritual power, because their lives were attractive. And we've also noticed that they didn't grow because their worship was attractive. We've seen that outsiders were not admitted into their worship services. And the question for us now: did their worship services, from which the outsiders were excluded, nevertheless contribute to the church's numerical growth? I believe it did. And I think that their worship services, which were off limits to outsiders, were essential to their growth. Why? Because their services, which offered praise and thanks to God, were essential in shaping the character of the Christians and the character of their communities. Their services shaped their lives to be Christ-like, their lives to be attractive, their lives to be interesting, and thus to draw outsiders. Worship, I believe, shapes the worshiper. It shapes their lifestyle. It shapes their witness. And so, worship which in the early centuries the outsiders were not allowed to take part in, nevertheless shaped a church that reflected the character of God and that outsiders wanted to go to considerable difficulties to join. Let's look at how this happened. We'll begin with the first 2 centuries, prior to around 200 AD. And when we look at these early centuries, we face problems as historians, because there aren't that many records, and there were lots of Christian communities scattered around the ancient world, which varied quite a bit. And many of them had patterns of worship which were their own, different from others. So can we say anything general about the worship of these communities? I think a few things. Their worship was domestic. The early Christians for several centuries met in houses. Their worship, I believe, was participatory. A variety of people took part. Their worship involved the Bible, reading the Bible, possibly teaching from it to exhort people in the way that they lived. And their worship involved prayers in which a number of people prayed. And centrally, the worship involved a meal. From an early date, Christians saw the meal both as a means of feeding people and also as a place of access to exceptional spiritual power. And so, in the first 2 centuries, there was a wide variety of worship practice. Some Christians worshipped in the morning, some in the evening. Some services involved a full meal. Others had only token amounts of food, bread and wine, bread and water. Even some services probably had vegetables. But this is the point. During the first 2 centuries, Christian gatherings for worship were already shaping the Christian witness. How did this happen? One way was through the homily, in which the president or the community's leader exhorted the people. A sample is in the passage that we're going to be looking at now, an anonymous sermon from the 2nd century. After the New Testament, this is the oldest Christian sermon that we've got. So let's look at it together.
For the Lord says, "My name is continually scoffed at by all peoples." How was it scoffed at? When the heathen hear God's oracles on our lips, they marvel at their beauty and greatness. But afterwards, when they mark that our deeds are unworthy of the words we utter, they turn from the scoffing and say it is a myth and a delusion. When, for instance, they hear from us that God says, "It is no credit to you if you love those who love you, but it is to your credit if you love your enemies and those who hate you." When they hear these things, they are amazed at such surpassing goodness. But when they see that we fail to love not only those who hate us, but even those who love us, then they mock at us and scoff at the name.
Well, the first thing that stands out to me is they mock our deeds are unworthy of the words we utter. So they're seeing a double standard, maybe.
Okay. And a concern for integrity,
Yeah.
isn't there? What else strikes you?
It strikes me a bit that I feel a bit ashamed as a Christian that we don't love the ones that we love, and not the one that we hate.
I also like when they say it is a myth and a delusion, that maybe their faith is a myth and a delusion. What they're saying isn't there.
Okay. It's not there because the way they live gives the lie to what they say. And what is the core conviction of this community?
The Christian community?
Yeah.
Well, they're supposed to be living what they're saying, but it doesn't seem that they are.
And what are they saying?
To love everyone.
Including loving
The
their enemies.
Yeah.
So here is a community that talks about loving the enemies. And the outsiders hear that and say, wow, this is amazing. And then they look at the Christians and they see, well, they don't even do it with each other very well. I'm wondering whether the whole thing is a sham. But note the central element in their witness is a vision that is exciting, that challenges outsiders, backed up by a lifestyle that bears that out. And the task of the leadership in this worship setting is to remind people of the vision and to inspire them to live it.
Yeah.
Now, this is small scale. This is probably a situation in which the leader knows the people very well, looks at them, knows their foibles, loves them, and is reminding them of what their calling is. So the sermon is probably interactive and dialogical, and probably Hannah would be raising questions about it in the middle of it or whatever. So this concern is a sample in early Christian worship, and that is to keep the Christians living distinctly, to keep them living with integrity. And we know that this wasn't easy. They didn't always share, as the New Testament inspired them to do. They didn't always love each other or love their enemies, as Jesus had taught. They were fearful of death. And I think we can sympathize with them in all of these things. Nevertheless, numerous accounts from the period indicated that the Christians were living a distinctive lifestyle, and that this lifestyle led to the growth of their numbers, and that this lifestyle was shaped by what they did when they gathered in corporate worship. Now, I've been talking about the first 2 centuries, and I've been talking about a church that's growing, and here comes the interesting thing. From about AD 200 onwards, the church that had been growing by 40% per decade started to grow really rapidly. 40% per decade builds up rapidly. And in the 3rd century, the numbers are growing very rapidly. We're going to see on our timeline that the graph really takes off at that period. And as the churches grew, they became less domestic, they became less personal, they became more uniform, they became more hierarchical. And these tendencies shifted even more after the conversion of the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. But they were already changing in the 3rd century. Missional success changes the church and confronts it with new problems, as well as new opportunities, of course. To get a feel of what was going on here, I'd like us to look at some drawings of the earliest known church building that archaeologists have been able to discover. This comes from Dura Europos on the border between Syria and Iraq. This is the same structure. It began as a domestic dwelling, and the top drawing is of the domestic dwelling. Down at the bottom right is the door to the street. That's where the deacon would stand. In the middle is a kind of courtyard. And then there are domestic rooms that surround it. The room on the left, 4A, is probably the room in which people had meals. And that's probably where the Christian community started meeting. But the church was growing. And around 240, the family that had lived there, could have been a relatively wealthy family, left the building, and the church made it the house of the church. And what they did at that point then was, you see on the left, they knocked down the wall. And so suddenly they had a bigger meeting room in which probably 75 people could gather as opposed to 40 or 35. And on the right at the top, there is, do you see that little rectangular receptacle? That's a baptistry. And so what they're doing is converting this house to the needs of a church. It's still from the outside, looks the same, but inside, the scale is bigger, it's becoming more formalized. They are doing frescoes on the wall. And you can see that, a group of 70, 75 is different from a group of 35. Mm-hmm. Its group dynamics are different. And so we find church growth changing the ethos and the dynamics of worship. And it could well be at this time that they move away from having a full meal as a part of the regular service, and that the elements, the bread and the wine, become more formalized, more in token quantities. So the caloric intake diminishes, as hopefully the spiritual power is constant or even increasing. We don't know. At any rate, so this is a hint then of the kind of thing that's going to happen in the 3rd century. And I'd like us to look at some pictures. We don't have many pictures. Pictures that record scenes of worship in the 3rd century. And just what do you see? What's there?
Well, it seems to be a meal.
A meal.
The one man seems to be handing out bread from a basket.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And the other ones are drinking.
Yeah. Okay.
See a couple raising their hands, raising their right hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. How many people?
Well, we're 7, including.
Yeah. Okay. They're gathered around a table. Let's look at the next one.
Again, eating and drinking.
Yeah. This comes from, like the last one, from a catacomb. And you will note that rectangular area. That's where a body was buried. Mm-hmm. But here, the Latin says, the first refers to agape, which means love. And it could well be that there is a person named agape. And then it says, mix some for us. Now, is it the wine that's being mixed? We're not quite sure what's going on here. Let's try another one.
Well, again, 7 people sitting around the table.
What's on the plates?
2 fish. A fish in each plate.
Isn't that interesting? Uh-huh. Now, you see, these are in catacombs. This looks a bit more formal than the previous one, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. This is from the catacomb of Priscilla. I find it utterly beautiful. And it's been known as the breaking of bread, the fructio panis. And you see, when you deal with these, you're dealing with pictures that scholars have said over many years are pictures of Christians at Eucharist. And it could be that, and for some of them, but it could also be that they are records of a Eucharist and agape that are somehow mixed together. Or they could be that these are meals that are held in the catacombs, in the presence of the tombs, where they are giving thanks on the anniversaries of the death of the departed, which they viewed as birthdays. You didn't mourn on the anniversary of a death, but you gave thanks to God that these people had now been resurrected and were in the presence of God. Just a final picture here. And so what we don't know is precisely what's going on here. But there seem to be these constants that are present. Gathered around a table, hands raised, often drinking, eating bread, and occasionally fish on the table. Now, at their worst, these sessions in the catacombs could become really rowdy. One scholar has called them rowdy ceremonial picnics. People celebrating, people becoming drunk. And Christian leaders spoke out against this kind of thing. And these were then Christian analogs to typical pagan practice. So these are pictures then that we've got here. A final ensemble in which you see that meal at the very heart. And you can see lots of little shelves where the departed would have been put in. Mm-hmm. And if we had time, we'd look in detail at that picture. It's full of symbolism. For example, at the top right, see at the very under the ceiling.
Oh yeah.
It's the whale disgorging Jonah. Yeah, so, anyway, now we're going to be looking at what happens in the 3rd century. In the 3rd century, we start having more evidence. Congregations becoming bigger. The typical Sunday worship now generally in 2 parts. The service of the Word and the service of the Eucharist. Catechumens were allowed to be present in the service of the Word, but not outsiders. And in the service of the Eucharist, the catechumens had to leave, and only the baptized were present. We already see this pattern in Justin in the middle of the previous century. But now we find the services more developed. What went on in the service of the Word? Really 2 things. The one was that the Bible was read. You know, we're in a world in which only about 10% of the people are literate. And so the reading out loud of the Bible was just incredibly important. Reading from the prophets, reading from the Old Testament, but also then reading from the New Testament, the memoirs of the apostles, namely the Gospels. And you can imagine how illiterate people just drank those texts in and remembered them. And then the sermon in which the president or the leader of the community would apply the passages to the lives of the people. Like that sermon that we saw previously. How can we live this vision in our lives? What do we need to change in order to live the vision better? So an emphasis upon living in such a way that the community would have integrity and that its witness would be attractive. And then, midway through the worship, the catechumens, the people who are being prepared for baptism, leave, and the baptized remain. And what happened in this? Really 3 things happened in the service of the Eucharist, each of which had its own spiritual power. And these are the prayer, the kiss, and then the Eucharistic service itself. Let's just remind ourselves of how Christians looked when they prayed.
Hands raised.
Mm-hmm.
Hands raised.
Eyes open.
Posture.
Standing.
Yeah.
Standing. They weren't kneeling. They weren't sitting. One early Christian writing said that you can sit to pray if you have some serious leg condition. But the proper posture was to stand. And so you can see a group of people standing, maybe in a circle or maybe, in several circles. And this is a time of immense spiritual concentration. And they believed that prayer was potent. And we're going to see that now in this next passage.
Yes. Prayer knows nothing except to call souls of the fallen back from the very path of death, to restore the weak, to cure the sick, to purify those possessed by demons, to open the doors of a prison, to loose the bonds of the innocent. Prayer washes away sins, repels temptations, extinguishes persecutions, consoles the discouraged, delights the generous, accompanies travelers, calms waves, paralyzes robbers, supports the poor, rules the rich, lifts up the fallen, upholds those who are falling, maintains those who are standing. Prayer is a wall of faith, our arms and weapons that protect us on every side against our enemy. Thus, we never go forward unarmed. Well, yeah, it's definitely, like you said, very potent. It's their wall of faith, their arms and weapons that protect them.
Okay. They lack other arms, but this is more potent than other arms might be. What else do you note?
They never go forward unarmed.
What kind of subjects do their prayers deal with?
Opening doors of prisons.
Supports the poor. Rules the rich.
Extinguishes persecutions. Consoles the discouraged.
You can note certain things about the early Christian life. I mean, we mentioned persecution. Here it says it accompanies travelers. And we've noted the way in which the early Christians were disproportionately mobile. So they were on the way. What about robbers?
Yeah, paralyzes robbers.
Yeah.
Okay. It fits in with stories I've heard from Christians in Africa today. You know, the way in which prayer simply stops robbers. Or if they've been robbed, they pray for the conversion of the robber. You know, marvelous. It is simply an all-embracing experience of bringing the world that they encountered into the presence of God, believing that God could do more than they can ask or imagine. And so you can see this as a time in which there is God's power that is being invoked, and God can do amazing things, and they ask God to do amazing things. And this then shapes their witness. So a community of prayer is going to witness in a way that a community that doesn't pray will not be empowered to do. Prayer central to their worship. Let's go on to the second element, and this is the kiss. The kiss of peace, the kiss of love, which came at the end of the prayers. The kiss celebrated the presence of the Holy Spirit in the community. The kiss was the moment at which members of the community who had hurt each other could say sorry before they received the Eucharist. So it was a time of reconciliation. And it was something that indicated the bondedness of the family, which transcended social class. It was a way of establishing boundaries. Now, of course, the kiss could go off the rails. And there are reports from early Christians of ways in which Christians were chastised for kissing twice because it gave pleasure. Or there are places in which there was a resounding sound of the kiss, which was obviously going overboard. The kiss was a rite that could go wrong. But when it was functioning properly, the kiss could have a real impact on the church's mission. Remember, back to the first video, from the amphitheater in Carthage, where people were gathered for an afternoon's gory entertainment and watched the Christians as they, in virtually their last act before they were killed, in which they embraced each other with the holy kiss. People saw the Christians behaving in their last acts as they had behaved in worship. And they were amazed. The kiss shaped a people that was reconciled and reconciling. It shaped a peaceable community that outsiders looked at in wonder and that some wanted to join. And then, in the third place, after the kiss, there would be the Eucharist, the communion itself, which was the climax of the Sunday service. Congregations were developing traditions of Eucharistic prayers, of prayers at communion, but they were still improvising these in the 3rd century. They didn't have written texts until the 4th century. The ministers prayed according to local traditions and according to their own abilities, not saying memorized formulae, word by word. Was the Eucharist at this time still connected to a meal? Probably in most urban churches, which were growing rapidly in the 3rd century, not. The congregations are now too big for that. So in the services there would be less food than there had been, but the experience of eating bread, generally coupled with drinking wine mixed with water, was very powerful. 3rd century Christians formulated this in different ways, but they generally believed that the bread and wine conveyed to the worshiper the very presence of Christ. This tasting of Christ transformed the worshiper. It radicalized them, and it changed their mission. It changed their understanding of what life was about. It made them odd but intriguing. Let's read a sentence from Bishop Cyprian of Carthage in which he talks about this.
The hand that has held the Eucharist will not be solid, but a blood-stained sword.
There is something contradictory between the blood of Christ and the blood of the enemy. Or let's look at another passage from Cyprian, this one from one of his letters.
The soldiers of Christ must equip themselves with the weapons of unblemished faith and valorous strength. They must reflect that the reason why they drink each day the cup of the blood of Christ is that they themselves may thus be enabled to shed their blood for Christ's sake.
And so what we have here is communion that is related to a willingness to martyrdom. And note that it's every day. I wonder what was going on there in North Africa. Because generally in early Christianity, the Eucharist is a weekly celebration of the community. But here in North Africa, people may have taken some of the wine home. We're not sure. So what do we have here? Our question in these videos is, how did the early church grow? And what we see in this video is that the worship services, which were closed to the outsiders, were nevertheless essential to the church's growth. Why? Because their worship services enabled the Christians to meet God, to be empowered by that encounter, and then to be shaped so that they, as Christians, would be attractive and intriguing to outsiders. Worship in the early centuries, I argue, shaped a witnessing community that was distinctive and that was so life-giving that others wanted to join it, even if it got them in trouble. And the early Christians did get in trouble. Let's close this video with a story of Christians in trouble. By about 250 AD, the church had been growing quite rapidly, and it grew to the point that the emperor, Decius, decided that the church really needed to be put down, that the empire centrally would need to organize an empire-wide persecution. And so the emperor ordered all Christians, especially the clergy, to sacrifice to the pagan gods and to sign a certificate saying that they had so sacrificed. Some Christians who loved life, who loved their grandchildren, who were afraid, sacrificed. They, to use the term of the time, lapsed. Others, such as Bishop Cyprian, went into exile. And some Christians who stayed at the spot were martyred for their faith, executed. After 9 months or so of persecution, the emperor died and the persecution ended. But many Christian communities around the Roman Empire were traumatized by the experience. How was the church to handle its members who had signed that certificate or who had sacrificed? How were Christians to relate further to the pagans who had persecuted them? They didn't have much time to think about this, because in 251, a year after the persecution. There came another disaster, an epidemic. The plague, probably the measles, affected everybody. It affected pagans and Christians alike. It affected the lapsed as well as the faithful. And there wasn't any penicillin. So the death toll was simply incredible. Possibly up to a third of the populace of the Roman Empire died in this incredible epidemic. How should Christians respond to this crisis? There were rich citizens in Carthage in North Africa that would leave the city and that would go out to their villas in the countryside where things seemed to be safer. There were pagan priests who left the city, who left their people, and who went away. What should the Christians do? And this is a point where Christian leadership exercised in worship expresses itself. And we're now going to look at Bishop Cyprian of Carthage in a scene recorded by his biographer, Pontius.
When the people were assembled together in one place, he, Cyprian, first of all urged the benefits of mercy. Then afterwards he added that there was nothing wonderful in our cherishing our own people, only with the needed attention of love, but that one might become perfect, who would do something more than the publican or the heathen, who overcoming evil with good and practicing a clemency which was like the divine clemency, loved even one's enemy, who would pray for the salvation of those that persecuted them, as the Lord admonish and exhorts. God continually makes his sun to rise, and from time to time gives showers of nourish, the seed exhibiting all these kindnesses, not only to the people, but to aliens also. If someone professes to be a child of God, why not be imitators of the Father? Thus what is good was done to all, not to those only who are of the household of faith.
So here is another sermon in a situation of worship. What's going on here?
Well, I think they're being encouraged to not only be kind to their own, but also to outsiders.
Uh-huh. Not only to their own, but to outsiders. Mm-hmm. To be kind, can you imagine what being kind would be like?
Yeah. Quite hard for them.
Yeah. I mean, it probably involved something, I mean, they didn't have medicines. Mm-hmm. It involved visiting. Mm-hmm. It involved bringing water. Mm-hmm. It involved bringing bread. Mm-hmm. Just the most elementary of nursing. And people who know about such things indicate that the survival rate of people who receive elementary nursing is vastly higher than the people who receive no care. Mm-hmm. So it probably means visiting. Now, whom were they to visit?
The people that were sick.
The people that were sick. And who was sick?
Everyone.
All kinds of people.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Pagans as well as Christians. Mm-hmm. Thus good was done to all. Mm-hmm. We don't cherish only our own, but we cherish others. Mm-hmm. Now why? What does he base his appeal upon? What passage in the Bible do you think he's referring to?
Love your enemies.
Mm-hmm. Love your enemies. Pray for your
enemies. Pray for the ones who persecute you.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, he's referring to the passages probably in Matthew 5, in which Jesus admonishes his followers to love their enemies. And then he goes on to say things. I mean, here, for example, God continually makes his sun to rise. Mm-hmm. And Jesus in Matthew 5 says, the rise upon the just and the unjust. Mm-hmm. The showers nourish the seed of the just and the unjust. Mm-hmm. And Jesus says, if you love your enemies, you are unlike the publican and the heathen. And it's precisely the appeal. Mm-hmm. He's urging the people to be distinctive by being true to Jesus and by being unlike the pagans who are fleeing the cities to save their lives. Mm-hmm. So a unique approach to this pestilence, and rooted in the gospel, and one which is also rooted in the deepest of Christian convictions. What happens to a Christian when the Christian dies?
It's good. It's not considered bad.
That's right. We are safe. Yes. We go on the shoulders of the Good Shepherd into eternal life. We do not need to be made sad by death. Cyprian has preached this repeatedly. And so the Christian gospel, in which there is safety for those who know Jesus and who follow him, who worship him, there is safety. This enables people to be radical. Their faith enables them to do something that is imprudent, that might kill them, but that causes the church to grow, because a church that nurses its own people has a higher survival rate than society as a whole. And a church that nurses outsiders enables them to survive, and when they survive, they are grateful and interested. And so what we find here is not the church asking, how can we be missional? Rather, they are being missional in that they are participating in God's mission, which is bringing life to others, and people respond with intrigue and gratitude, and the church grows. So, here in plague-stricken Carthage, in 251, the Christians are responding to an epidemic in a way that was odd but intriguing. They responded by nursing their pagan neighbors. They responded to loving those who had persecuted them and loving them even to death. And why did they do this? Because of what the worship of God had changed them to be. In the Great Plague in the mid-3rd century, the Christians who worshiped the God who was revealed in Jesus Christ behaved attractively. And their attractive behavior, which served and loved their neighbors, served and loved their enemies, was inspired by Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which was read and pondered in worship. Worship shaped their witness, and through their witness, the church was growing.